when I do a training of any sort, if we can go down to the individual slide number 4, I normally do an exercise, a folding paper exercise, where I get everyone to close their eyes, fold the piece of paper in half, tear off a piece on the left-hand corner, fold it again, tear off a piece on the right-hand corner, fold it again, and tear off another piece. And everyone hears the same instructions at the same time. There's nothing different. There's no right or wrong. And then tell them to open the piece of paper, and every single paper, over the years that I've done this exercise, every single piece of paper has had different holes in different places. So totally different processing of information. So same information, different people. And the purpose of this exercise is to illustrate how we are all so very different because of so many reasons, that the outcomes of what we do may be different, our emotional state may be different because of it, and also people with the same labels, the same diagnoses, the same experiences, all come out differently with different reactions, different ways of dealing with it. And the same for us who actually work in the area. We are also very different. We come with different backgrounds, with different emotions, with different psyches, and we process information differently, meaning that we all can either cope with one type of client and some of us can't, and it's the same client. So it's quite an impactful exercise. Talking about it doesn't feel as impactful. So just as an introduction of my work with the Holocaust survivors, with people who've been through early trauma. So I am at heart a social worker. I'm not a psychologist. I have done a master's in counseling, so a lot of my work is counseling. But as a social worker, it's an absolute marriage of counseling together with casework. And I find that together, and using social opportunities and using other things to make the person's life easier or better, makes a huge difference when I am doing counseling as well. So if you want to move ahead on the slides, sorry, everyone, I'm not controlling the slide, so it's going. Okay, I will just carry on. I'm not going to go into details of the Holocaust. It's all on the internet, or you all know what it is anyway. But if we look at people before the Holocaust, they had a history, they had family connections, they had a certain kind of parenting, and they had a certain makeup in themselves. Some might have had a predisposition for mental health issues, and some might not have. And then during the Holocaust, again, very, very different experiences. So some went through the death camps, through concentration camps, some were in ghettos, some were evacuated, some were in hiding in the most awful, awful places. And coming out of the Holocaust, and interestingly enough, the highest percentage of Holocaust survivors per capita outside of Israel have come to Australia. So Australia was really welcoming, and the stories that I've had from survivors, how the relief they felt, and someone especially spoke to me about sitting with her baby on Bondi Beach, and a whole group of people came towards her, and she had a post-traumatic reaction and started screaming, but they were all so wonderful to her, and then she realized she wasn't in the Holocaust anymore. So the other part of the after the Holocaust, so during the Holocaust, people lost everything. They lost family, they lost community connections, they lost trust, they lost faith, they lost every possible thing over an extended period. It wasn't a short one-off trauma, it was a long, multiple trauma experience. After the Holocaust, it didn't end for many. So the worst thing I had heard from someone was after the Holocaust, she went to her hometown and there was nobody there who cared that she survived. She was on her own. So after the Holocaust, people came to, well, if they came to Australia, and Australia at that time didn't have what we have today. So there was no Centrelink to help them straight away. There was no language learning. There were no jobs for them to just go into. And there was no psychological support. So all the trauma, everything they'd gone through, all the memories, all the torture, the degradation, the losses, the grief, all remained right inside of these people for decades. In fact, there was a conspiracy of silence that survivors did not speak for a number of reasons. One, they didn't think that anyone could really understand what they were going through. They didn't want to upset people. But more to the point, there was no language to describe what they went through, even in their own mother tongue. For example, how do you say that you watched your mother and your father walking to gas chambers while they were being beaten up? And then you have to fill out a form later. How did your parents die? It wasn't death, it was absolute torture all the way along. So the language wasn't even there for them to express themselves. So all the years, there was silence. Even within the families, there was silence. A lot of families have told me that the silence was broken at night during nightmares. That's when they heard what the parents had gone through. There was a client that I worked with in grief counseling. His mother had just died. He wasn't even aware that his mother was Jewish. His father was a Polish man who had rescued his mother and brought her to Australia. And all the years they actually teased her about being a Jewish mother, him and his sister, because she was so anxious about them. She was so scared every time they left the house, and there were nightmares. Only later in her life did she actually own her identity when her cognition started declining, and he actually learned about her past. And in his words, the steel plates of the earth under him started shifting. He'd lost his mother, he lost his identity, and he had all the symptoms of a second generation survivor. So that silence, interestingly enough, was actually broken by the movie producer Steven Spielberg, who was involved in Schindler's List movie. And he realized that all these survivors were suffering even more because of the silence that they kept. And he actually set up a worldwide video project where thousands and thousands of survivors told their story on video. And so many of them have told me that actually helped them because they know their story was going somewhere. They know their story was being kept forever. That bearing witness to what had happened to them started a little bit of a healing process for them because it was outside of them now, and then they could actually start talking more to their families and to outside people. So if we can go forward on the slides. Okay, okay, and again forward. And again, we're way behind. And again, yeah. Okay, so what do survivors deal with? And I'm going to illustrate each one to show how these emotions are within that person, no matter who they are. So I worked with a psychiatrist who was a Holocaust survivor, and her biggest issue was survivor guilt. She understood it intellectually, but she could not forgive herself for surviving when she said her family, who was so much better people than she was. They had all perished and she was still alive. How we dealt with that was I actually used a little bit of a narrative approach with her, trying to work out what would her parents who she had adored, what would they have said about her as a successful psychiatrist, how she had built up a life afterwards. Would they think that she should be guilty? What would they say about her guilt? And what would they say about how she had lived her life after the Holocaust? And the guilt actually did subside a bit. And she told me that after that way of looking at things, she actually had a number of conversations in the middle of the night with her parents, trying to explain to them how she couldn't save them, she couldn't help them. And she felt that that was a huge thing in her life, that she found a way to speak to them. Delayed mourning and not being able to perform the mourning rituals is also a huge thing for older survivors, especially because other people in their lives, for example, spouses, are also dying, and that re-triggers the grief from previous losses. So here I used more of a social work solution. We did with one client whose parents, she never knew what had happened to them in the Holocaust. Her sister had also died, but she didn't know what happened to her. And then her brother died while I was working with her. He was overseas, and she could not cope with the grief, mainly for her parents. She started having nightmares about not being able to find their bodies and hunting for their bodies. So we discussed what she could do. How could she bury them how could she actually lay them to rest without actually burying them in the ground again? She would never find them. And what we did was the Jewish Museum in Darlinghurst have a special room where people put up a memorial plaque for people who died in the Holocaust. So we organized a whole morning with all her friends. They all came. She spoke about her parents, and this then 90-year-old lady lived another 2 years, quite at peace. It was in her grief. She still missed them, and she missed all the time that she could have, should have, if only would have had with them. She often spoke in those words, but she didn't have that absolute debilitating grief that came up after her brother died. Feelings of worthlessness is something that many of the survivors picked up during the Holocaust, because that's how they were dealt with, as worthless human beings, as really having no value to humanity at all. And unfortunately, it's a hard thing to get rid of, especially for child survivors who really struggle with it. So again, we had to find other ways for them to think about it and to try and find some worth in themselves. And a really strange example was a wonderful lady who really attracted everyone. She was such a lovely spirit, but she felt she had no worth to the title Holocaust survivor. She could not face other survivors because they were in camps and she wasn't. She was in a ghetto for a while but escaped, and she kind of wandered around. Her husband and her could not find each other during the war, and she had a little baby, but she managed to survive literally in the streets with her baby because of her wonderful personality. And that's what got her through all the years. So what we focused on was that she did suffer, and we actually went through, and I literally made her tell me, how did it feel to be wandering the streets with a baby, never knowing if you were going to get arrested? How did it feel not to know where your husband was? How did all these things feel? And I knew she could take it. She had a lot of strength in her. So she actually managed to get out that she did suffer. And with that, we actually worked on who she was, and all the things that she did to survive in the Holocaust was what got her through all the years after the Holocaust. And she was still using those things where her husband had dementia, and yet she attracted everyone to help her. I don't know if you all know that often when somebody has dementia, friends depart in droves because they don't know how to deal with it. Her friends stayed with her, and we actually connected how she managed to get people to help her during the Holocaust to her current time. Trust, I guess, is a really common thing, or lack of trust, and it's a huge thing, and it takes a lot of work and a lot of effort to actually engender trust in a Holocaust survivor, especially because everybody let them down, and they let themselves down as well. And if they were religious before, God let them down. There was nothing to trust. The government let them down, everybody. And I guess that applies to most people who've been through a political trauma, a war, anything. They've been let down. Who do you trust? And coming for help, I remember reading somewhere that Holocaust survivors don't often go for psychological help. How they access help is, I need a cleaner, I need to find another place to live, all the practical things that are very acceptable. And then we weave in all the support and all the psychological things in the middle. But if we contrived, if we come across as I know everything and I'm the professional, it really so rarely works. I mean, we don't do that anyway, but especially with survivors, because I mean, for me, I've read a fortune, spoken a fortune to people, but I don't know what they've gone through. They know what they've gone through. They are truly the expert on what they've gone through. And having that stance of them educating me on them being the experts in it, then allows me to go in with some kind of psychological interventions to try and find ways, A, to get them to trust me, but B, to relieve that constant anxiety and the constant regrets and all the other emotions. So trust is an absolute huge thing. Control, actually just getting back to trust, the most phenomenal thing that I saw, one of my students, I linked her with a survivor and I warned her she won't trust you. The student came back to tell me that the Holocaust survivor had told her things about her experience that she had never told anyone else. And I asked her, please tell me, what did you do? And what she did was tell her, I won't ever have that opportunity to know what you went through, what it was about. Please teach me. And she won that woman over, because there is a thing of bearing witness. In today's world, the Holocaust is something that there's a lot of denial about, and this young student did the absolute opposite. Control is a huge issue. And losing control when they've lost every bit of control in the past is something that I come across a lot. And even when the survivor loses cognitive skills, the desire for control remains there. Health is a very huge issue because it's a result of malnutrition, of torture, of beatings, of experimentation during the Holocaust. But there's also often a huge mistrust of the medical world because of what some doctors did. There was a lot of experimentation during the Holocaust. I'll come to deteriorating cognition later. Just about trauma. So I find this a very useful method of looking at what has happened to cause a survivor to have traumatic responses to, or post-traumatic responses to what seem like fairly innocent events. So the triggers trigger emotions that are there, and they come out because there's something in that trigger, and it could be anything. And that is why we really need the stories. We need the background of the people that we're working with. So if I may give you some examples, I'm just looking at the time, how I'm doing. Okay. One woman who was cognitively as sharp as anything was in a rehab hospital after a hip operation. The nurse really kindly went around at night with a torch just to check up on her, and she literally went berserk because she was flung right back to Auschwitz, where the guards came around with torches, and it took a long time to settle her. And then she was referred to me, and we actually went through all the things that trigger her. She really wanted to go through to anticipate what would trigger her, because she was somebody who was really in control, a very successful woman. And that actually helped her because she was so cognitively sharp that understanding what could trigger her, she could either avoid it or be prepared for it. She was a woman who was quite wealthy. She was gluten intolerant. She would take every single roll on the table at a restaurant because she was re-triggered to the starvation times. Another woman who did have cognitive deterioration, I used to visit her, and she used to leave the door open for me and others. And then I was told by her carers and her family that every time somebody came to visit her, she started screaming, and nobody could understand why. The one day I went to visit her, somebody knocked on the door and she started screaming. And then I remembered how she had told me, and she could only tell me her Holocaust stories in Yiddish. She couldn't, and she was fluent in English, but the Holocaust was only in Yiddish. How there was a bang, bang, bang on the door, and her father was taken away, and she never saw him again. That was so easily fixed. We bought the most irritating doorbell with a jingle, and she was happy as anything with that. Aging is itself a huge trigger for survivors, because in the camps, any sign of weakness, any sign of deterioration was a chance that you would get killed by the guards. So even such a thing like aging is a very hard thing for the survivor to actually deal with. There's just one more thing with triggers, and it's to do with anesthetics. One of our clients had an operation. She was fine before. I think she might have had also hip operation. And when she came out, she literally went berserk. She was thrashing and throwing her arms around, and they could not calm her down. And there was about to be a diagnosis of a psychosis when her case manager at the time remembered that her story in the Holocaust was where her whole village had to dig a mass grave, and they were shot and they fell into the grave. She wasn't shot, but she fell into the grave and actually had to claw her way out of all the arms and the legs. So all the pipes that were going in and out of her were the arms and the legs that she was seeing. Okay, if we can go to the next one. Okay, and we can move, if you want to just have a quick look at this and then move on. Okay, so the intergenerational transmission of trauma is something really quite important because it impacts widely, it impacts on the community. So the first generation experienced the trauma directly. The second generation literally absorbs the trauma like a sponge, because all the anxiety, all the anger, all the avoidance of situations is imposed on that second generation. There's an overprotection of the second generation because the parents are so scared if they are survivors that something will happen to their child. the opposite is also true. There's an obligation, a feeling of obligation from that second generation to make things better for their parents. So they go out, some of them go out of their way and devote their whole lives to look after the parents, and they become very anxious and almost absorb the trauma. So there are also post-traumatic symptoms coming up. And then they become parents, and we have a third generation. There's a lot of research in this, into epigenetics, into the incidence of presentations to psych units of the third generation, which at one stage appears higher than the average population. But it's something that isn't a deliberate thing, and yet with the first to the second is. There's also the issue is both parents survivors, and do they have, if they were child survivors, what experience did they have in parenting? They never learned what it was, or they were never exposed to parenting, especially the younger kids. So it really was a huge impact, which is going down the generations. So the second generation really looks at the parents as a victim and needing protection. The third generation, on the other hand, has actually done a lot for that first generation in seeing them as survivors. And the schools have done a lot of work in taking the histories of the survivors, so the grandchildren interview their grandparents, and they put them on the level of a hero, you survived, which has its own pressures because they feel they have to survive forever. And one of the things we often have phone calls about is, for example, from hospitals, that the family won't let their survivor parent, grandparent go. It's time, there's nothing more to do. They're really elderly, they won't let them go. So it's quite a huge issue. I'm nearly out of time here, so slide on. Cognitive decline is almost the ultimate in torture, because so many survivors go back to the worst memories, and there is so much that triggers them. And so somebody's cognitively okay can eventually differentiate that what I'm experiencing is a post-traumatic symptom. With somebody with dementia, and the more advanced, the worse it is, there's no differentiation, and the nightmares and being triggered into, and I'll give you an example. Actually, the other day, one of our clients in her 90s was really not well. And the carer was really worried, so we got the ambulance to go. The woman was beside herself because of the uniforms. They had to leave. So we've put in place that if any medical people, ambulance, police come there, they have to take their uniform off before. She could not cope with it, and it took her ages to calm down. And unfortunately, especially with vascular dementia, there is quite a big incidence because of the things that happened in the war, with heart disease, with blood pressure, the anxiety, the depression, etc., and it impacts on vascular dementia. Okay, one forward. Okay, so the support we give, as I said in the beginning, I don't ever do pure counseling, or very, very rarely. And when we look at what are the psychotherapeutic interventions we use, well, we actually use whatever works. We're working with individuals. When I was studying, I was fascinated, and I still am, and it's something I use quite a lot, is narrative therapy. And I don't know if any of you know about the magic question or something. There's a question you ask, what would it look like if you woke up the next morning and the problems and all the trauma that you experienced didn't exist? I tried it out on my clients, and the response I got, and rightly so, was, Zimra, what are you doing? Because I really wasn't myself at all. I was putting on a counseling that hadn't sat properly with me yet, and most of my clients pick up anything that's not genuine very, very quickly. So I use a lot of narrative. I use some cognitive behavior therapy. It doesn't always work. Reminiscence therapy is sometimes beautiful, but it sometimes can be very triggering. What we also look at is helping the person find a meaning in things. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of Viktor Frankl, In Search of Meaning. He was a Holocaust survivor. And he actually quoted Friedrich Nietzsche by saying, he who has a why to live can almost be anyhow. So he found that during what he went through in the Holocaust, he managed to keep his dignity, managed to keep some spirituality. Nobody could take that from him. And that was his meaning. His meaning was also he was a psychiatrist, and he was very interested in how people responded to what they were going through. So he had meaning. So now we use that issue of meaning to try and help our survivors. So there are a lot of survivors who actually volunteer at the Jewish Museum as tour guides, and that gives meaning. We actually try and have a lot of social groups for Holocaust survivors, because together they form the community that they lost during the war. And it's actually, and I've been really privileged to be part of it at times. And it actually, it's very funny sometimes, because the stories they tell are horrific, but they laugh. There's a kind of a black humor. There's also a hierarchy of suffering that goes on in their conversation, but you can see the warmth and the togetherness and how much it helps them. And when we had to stop it through COVID, it was awful. We tried other things, and other things worked, including Zoom sessions where you could actually see everyone. So that worked a bit, but that togetherness, not being cut off from people, having some meaning, having some purpose. And if you go to the next slide. Okay, I don't know if any of you recognize this gentleman. Ernie Friedlander. He's had quite a bit to do with starts. Anybody might have met him. So we had a little, somebody's smiling. We had a little project going. What do I want to share with the next generation from my experience in the Holocaust? So yes, there is a lot of clinical work to do with survivors. Yes, there's a lot of casework to do, especially as they grow older. There's a lot of things that we do because we try and keep them at home rather than going into another institution or another home and having to leave their home. There's a lot that we try and do to keep them where they are. But if I may, I will read you what, have I got it? No, I haven't got it here. So what Ernie answered was he lost everyone except his mother in the Holocaust, but a German guard told they were going to go on one of the cattle train that actually was going to Auschwitz, and the German guard told his mother to drop down and pretend to tie his shoelace not to get onto that train. He doesn't know why that happened, doesn't know why the guard picked them, but that saved his life. And he has gone on to start an organization called Courage to Care, where he goes around to all the schools and all the organizations to talk about fighting racism, about accepting people. He is just the most beautiful of human beings, Ernie is. And he's been awarded, I think, with an MBE or one of those awards recently. So just to end off, which is not in my slides, I'd like to talk about we who work with people with trauma and what does that do to us, with taking into consideration the expression of vicarious traumatization. So I know that some of my team cannot cope with certain things, and I try and allocate those clients to other people. The lady that I spoke to you about, the torch at a hospital, rehab hospital, she had been seeing a psychologist for quite a time, and when I went to see her, she said she couldn't see her because she saw she was too upset with her story. She couldn't really express herself because it got to her too much. I don't know how she actually decided that I would cope with her, but somehow or the other I managed to do that. And I find that people eventually to start talking. So one of the gifts that I feel myself and my colleagues give to survivors is to listen to their story, to bear witness, but also to hold some of their pain. But what do we do with their pain? And that's where good supervision, etc., comes in. But it also, how I actually personally see it, I feel so touched and so privileged to be able to be the person that a survivor will tell me their story, that they will trust me with what they've been through. And in turn, I feel that they feel so grateful in a way that somebody's listening. And remember, I told you earlier on, they couldn't tell their stories. So I do encourage them to speak. I don't push anything. A lot of them won't tell me what they actually went through in the camps. And there are lots of things that I know people have told me that they're not proud of, but that's what got them to survive. And they skirt around those things. One of the most beautiful stories from also another beautiful human being was she had a scarf, a silk scarf, that was the only thing she had left of her mother. And she was the one who saw her parents walking down to the crematorium being killed, to the so-called showers. Her friend, and a very good friend from home, and she was lucky to go through the Holocaust with her, had diarrhea. And remember, I said any sign of weakness and you could get shot. She actually picked up the diarrhea off the floor, cleaned up her friend with a scarf, and chucked the scarf in the bin. I've had numerous conversations with her about the regret over the scarf and the pride in saving her life. And that is with all the survivors. There is so much pride that they've survived, and that endures. And there's also so much guilt that they survived, and that endures. And there's also so much trauma from all they've gone through, and it endures. And all that I feel that we can do, we can't take it away from them. The memories are there. The memories that in earlier years were literally locked into compartments inside themselves, coming out only in nightmares. And the memories as they get older and try and make sense of their life, and as their cognition may deteriorate a bit, and therefore their defense system may deteriorate a bit, the memories start coming out, and we can't take those memories away, even though talking about it and trying to find other ways of looking at it, and sometimes it's absolutely impossible. But it really is something that I feel, even taking a tiny little bit of the person's pain away, allowing them to enjoy more hours in the day through a social club or something like that, allowing them the relief to know that that there's somebody who cares and somebody who will hold their memories when they're gone, I feel is a big thing. And I did just one more thing. Nuri asked me to mention Ukrainian refugees that have come to our agency. So I have only met a few of the older ones, and it almost, I would say, prime time to actually work with survivors of whatever trauma after they've been through it, sooner after they've been through it than the Holocaust survivors. But my finding is that they don't actually want to go through that. They want to sort out their lives here. They want to find a Russian-speaking cardiologist One lady was about to go back to the Ukraine because she was so distressed at being here, and what fixed that, her daughter told me, was finding a Russian-speaking cardiologist who she trusted. So there was a trust issue. We do have Russian-speaking staff, so we've linked it with them. Our team downstairs with the families are working with families to find them housing, to find them good therapists in Russian, because none of them actually do speak Russian. So there's a lot of work around that, and obviously we also have been helping a lot financially to make sure that they're not going without essentials. So there's a lot we're doing around that, more in a way in a casework style than in a counseling style, which I guess isn't the topic of this workshop, this masterclass.
Thank you.
I think that's me for now. I mean, there's a lot more I could say, but I think that's me.